We're looking today at iconic photographs of the civil rights movement. First, let's consider what we mean when we call a photograph an icon. We live in an image saturated culture. Images are so abundant around us that it's hard for us to process everything that they show us. So, iconic images are strategically useful. In our time, iconic images and the verbal culture that surrounds them are essential to the way that we socially organize knowledge. Iconic images are like the handles of visual culture. They encapsulate much more than what they actually show. To call a photograph an icon, is something that builds on a visual cultural tradition that goes back much further than photography. In religious imagery, an icon is something that stands for something much broader than what it reveals. The visual contact with the sacred icon is an act of spiritual contact with something that you can't see through your senses, through something that you can see. So we contact something larger through looking at the icon. And that translates very clearly to the way that we relate to iconic photographs. While the icon itself, the religious icon, is a religious and spiritual phenomenon, the ability of an image to give us a sense of contact with something much bigger is what makes an iconic photograph different from other photographs. So when we're thinking of the qualities of an iconic photograph, it tends to have a sense of visual clarity. Formally speaking, compositionally speaking, it's easy to make out, it's easy to understand, it seems to speak for itself. The image becomes a shorthand for something much bigger than what it actually depicts in the image itself. And viewers of the photograph feel confident of their understanding of the image. They feel like what's in the image is simply a reflection of reality. So it's not a sense of feeling like you're interpreting it. You feel like the picture just shows you something. There's a high degree of social consensus as to the meaning of the photograph. So when you ask people what they mean by an iconic photograph or a photograph that's an icon, something that people typically say about it is everybody gets it. It communicates very directly. And that means that the interpretation that people get from the photograph is one that is shared. It feels natural. It feels like something that everybody gets. The image appears to be independent of context. The meaning of the photograph seems to be so clear that it doesn't matter where you encounter it, you're going to get the same message from it, whether it's on a book cover, in a book, on television, on your phone, or someplace else, independent of a place where somebody uses it to illustrate a story, for example. The photograph seems to be able to float around on its own. And the way that people talk about the photograph evolves over time. People become curious about the origins of the photograph and they fall back on stories that they've heard about what was happening, how the photographer got to be there, and what made it important. So there's what we call an evolving exegesis of the photograph. It has its own sort of social folklore. Taking the migrant mother as the iconic example of an iconic image. It's a photograph that people tend to recognize more than any other in American cultural life. It's formally simple, clear, and direct. We feel like we understand it very intuitively. It seems to be just broadcasting its message to us. And it seems to stand for something much bigger than this one woman, Florence Owens Thompson. It turns out her name was, but we don't know that when we're looking at the image as an icon. Okay, that person's name, where she came from, where her husband is, where the rest of her children are, what else she's doing there. We're not thinking about those things when we're looking at the photograph. There's a certain kind of range of ideas that it stands for, and that's what we feel like we're contacting when we look at the photograph. We feel like we are seeing poverty and motherhood and strength in the face of adversity, and these other bigger, broader ideas about the Great Depression, about history, and about America. So it stands for something much, much bigger than what is literally depicted in it as a photograph. So, the general consensus about iconic photographs is that they need no introduction because everybody gets it. But what does it mean to say that everybody gets it when it comes to what a photograph means or what it's about? The iconic photograph serves a socially unifying function that we take for granted when we say that it speaks for itself. The iconic photograph is based on widespread feelings about the subject of the photograph, which the image confirms as reality. And what I mean by that is that there are certain feelings that we share about about poverty, about motherhood, about the Great Depression, and that when we see those things reflected in the photograph seems to be evidence of something rather than a confirmation of feelings that we already had. We see a personification of a cultural whole. So, in the face of the person in the iconic photograph, we see a condition condensed in a moment, and we respond emotionally to the whole while focusing on the person who stands in for it. And that's like the connection that people have to the holy icon. Our eyes are fixed on a certain face, our emotions are resonant with the emotions that we see in that face, but those emotions have roots that go much, much deeper and broader. And that means that because that image works on a social level that way, we experience it individually, but we are at the same time experiencing it socially. And that means that the image has blind spots. The information the stuff that's going on elsewhere in the world, and information that doesn't make it into that relationship between what we feel and what we see, everything else, everything that complicates that feeling has to be bracketed off in order for the image to maintain its power. So in the case of the migrant mother photograph, when we're getting that sense of connection with that iconic image, we're not thinking about Florence Owens Thompson's background and life, the fact that she was raised on a reservation, she was raised Cherokee, she has this much bigger family. We're not thinking about that when we're seeing the image, and we're also seeing a specific personal story being told in that image, not the social factors that created the working conditions that she's living under, or what our role as viewers might be in relation to all of that. And in order for the icon to feel like an icon, the story has to be a simple one, and that means that it has to have blind spots.